At a cold schoolhouse doorway in Verdun, Eisenhower made one dry joke to Patton. Patton answered before anyone could laugh. But the real secret was not the joke. It was the two-word order Patton had already prepared before the room understood the disaster. Play ball. Those two words started the machine that turned the U.S. Third Army north toward Bastogne, and they reveal the part of the Battle of the Bulge most people miss. The 101st Airborne was not saved because Patton suddenly improvised a miracle. They were saved because, days before Eisenhower asked the impossible question, Patton's headquarters had already built the answer. On December 16, 1944, the Ardennes looked quiet enough to be dangerous. The Allied line ran through thick forest, broken roads, freezing villages, and ground so difficult that senior commanders treated it as a place to rest battered units. The assumption was simple. German armor could not make a decisive offensive through that terrain in winter. That assumption shattered before dawn. German artillery opened across the front. Infantry crossed through fog and trees. Panzers rolled out of assembly areas that Allied intelligence had not fully believed. Telephone lines went dead. Road signs disappeared. Units that thought they were holding a quiet sector suddenly found themselves inside the largest German attack in the West since D-Day. By the time the first reports reached higher headquarters, the shape of the front had already begun to bend. And inside Patton's Third Army, one man had been watching the bend before it happened. Brigadier General Oskar Koch, Patton's intelligence chief, had warned that something was wrong east of the line. German radio silence, unusual movement, missing routine traffic, formations that appeared too quiet, too concentrated, and too carefully hidden. Koch did not see the whole storm. No one did, but he saw enough, and Patton listened. While other headquarters treated the Ardennes as a secondary concern, Patton ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans. Not one plan, 3. Each one built around a different level of emergency. Each one asking the same insane question in advance. What if the Third Army had to stop pushing east, wheel north, and attack into the flank of a German offensive? That was not battlefield drama. It was staff work, maps, road tables, fuel estimates, bridge capacity, unit boundaries, corps assignments, timetables, telephone codes, the invisible machinery of war. And because that machinery already existed, Patton did not enter the Verdun conference as a man waiting for instructions. He entered as a man waiting for permission. Meanwhile, Bastogne was becoming the hinge of the entire battle. The town was not important because it was beautiful. It was important because roads met there. In the Ardennes, roads were power. Roads moved tanks, fuel, shells, food, wounded men, and entire divisions. Whoever controlled Bastogne could either keep the southern shoulder of the German attack locked in place or open the path for the offensive to deepen. The 101st Airborne Division reached Bastogne in open trucks, not in the clean, heroic way paintings like to remember it. Men rode through freezing air with inadequate winter gear, limited ammunition, and almost no time to understand the ground they were about to defend. They arrived barely ahead of the German noose. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. Inside the perimeter, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and the men under his command faced a kind of pressure that grows heavier by the hour. Fuel was low. Medical supplies were stretched thin. Artillery ammunition had to be counted like coins. Wounded men filled aid stations. The sky stayed closed, locking Allied aircraft on the ground when the garrison needed them most. Then came the German surrender demand. 2 officers entered under a flag of truce and delivered the ultimatum. The American answer became famous for one word: nuts. It sounded almost comic. It was not. It was defiance, spoken from a position that was still deeply fragile. Because a surrounded force can sound brave and still be running out of shells. A commander can refuse surrender and still know that refusal only matters if someone outside the ring can punch a road back in. And that is why the meeting at Verdun mattered. On December 19th, Eisenhower gathered senior commanders in a cold headquarters schoolhouse. The atmosphere was controlled, but no one in that room needed a map to understand the stakes. The German offensive had broken through. Bastogne was under threat. The weather had stolen Allied air power. The front was no longer a line. It was a problem spreading in every direction at once. Eisenhower began by imposing calm. There would be cheerful faces at the conference table. Not because the situation was cheerful, because panic travels faster than orders. Then he turned to Patton. How soon could the Third Army disengage from the Saar front and attack north toward Bastogne? Every officer in that room knew what the question meant. It meant pulling a field army out of one fight and throwing it into another. It meant turning corps headquarters, infantry divisions, armored divisions, artillery, engineers, fuel columns, repair crews, medical units, and thousands of trucks across icy roads in winter. It meant changing the direction of an army while the enemy was already moving. A cautious answer would have been a week. A normal answer would have been longer. Patton gave neither. He said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went still, not because the answer was loud, because it was impossible. Eisenhower warned him not to be foolish. If Patton moved too soon, the attack would go in piecemeal. A scattered relief attempt could fail before it ever reached Bastogne. Patton did not back away. He explained that his staff had already prepared the orders. The movement tables existed. The divisions had been selected. The machine could start with one signal. That is what separated confidence from bluff. Bluff says, I can do it. Preparation says, the orders are already written. Patton understood the German offensive differently from some of the men around him. To him, the bulge in the Allied line was not only a disaster. It was an exposed mass of enemy force pushing forward into a narrowing space. If the shoulders held, the Germans were not breaking through. They were driving their head into a trap. But Bastogne had to hold, and the Third Army had to move. As Patton left the meeting, Eisenhower delivered the line that later survived because it sounded like banter and meant much more. Funny thing, George. Every time I get a new star, I get attacked. Patton turned back. Yes, and every time you get attacked, I bail you out. It was arrogant, it was affectionate, and in that moment, it was close to true. Eisenhower had authority over the whole Allied war in the West. Patton had the one army that could pivot fast enough to matter. The exchange was not just 2 famous men trading ego. It was a private recognition of how their partnership actually worked. Eisenhower controlled the permission. Patton controlled the tempo, and Patton had already prepared the tempo before the permission arrived. At 9:15 that morning, Patton left the conference and contacted his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. The code phrase was simple: play ball. Across Third Army, planning became motion. The 4th Armored Division turned toward the north. The 80th Infantry Division began shifting toward Luxembourg. The 26th Infantry Division moved into the new alignment. Roads filled with convoys. Military police fought to control traffic. Engineers checked crossings. Fuel had to arrive where the maps said it would arrive. Men who had been facing east were suddenly told the war had moved. This is the part that disappears when the story is reduced to a single heroic sentence. Patton did not just turn an army. He turned everything an army needs in order not to die after it turns. And still, the relief of Bastogne was not clean. The legend says Patton promised 48 hours and then delivered exactly that. The battlefield was rougher than the legend. The attack north began under brutal conditions: ice, snow, jammed roads, poor visibility, and German resistance slowed the movement. The divisions did not glide toward Bastogne. They battered their way forward. Every village, road junction, and wooded rise could become a delay. Every delay mattered because the men inside Bastogne were still surrounded. Patton was aggressive, but he was not magic. On December 24th, he was frustrated enough to write that all efforts had still failed to make contact with the defenders. Eisenhower pressed for every possible effort. Patton, already living inside that effort, hour by hour, responded with the kind of anger only a field commander can feel when headquarters asks for urgency that he believes he has already spent. But Eisenhower also understood something essential about Patton. He did not need to make him care. He needed to keep him aimed. In later recollections, Eisenhower described Patton calling to apologize for the slow progress through the snow. Patton hated slowness. He hated weather more when weather made him look slow. Eisenhower asked the only question that mattered. "Are you still fighting?" When Patton said yes, Eisenhower let him fight. That was command too. Not the cinematic kind, the harder kind, knowing when to push and when not to break the man who was already pushing harder than anyone else. Then the weather changed. For a week, cloud cover had nearly erased one of the Allies' greatest advantages. Aircraft sat grounded while the men in Bastogne waited under artillery fire and cold. The sky was not background. It was a combatant. On December 23rd, the clouds finally lifted. C-47s and fighters appeared over the Ardennes. Supplies dropped into the perimeter. Allied aircraft struck German positions and movement routes. The defenders in Bastogne were still in danger, but they were no longer blind, silent, and alone in the same way. On the ground, the 4th Armored Division kept grinding forward. The spearhead belonged to men who had no room for legend while they were making it. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion. He was not yet the name stamped onto America's future main battle tank. He was a battalion commander driving Shermans through winter roads and defended villages, trying to crack a corridor before the garrison inside Bastogne reached the end of its margin. The southern approach was not an empty screen. German forces had layered defenses there for exactly this reason. They knew a relief attempt had to come from the south. They knew which roads mattered. They had guns, infantry, anti-tank positions, and cold ground that punished every mistake. Abrams and his men fought through it, yard by yard. By December 26th, the final push came through Assenois. A Sherman jumbo called Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, drove at the front of the column. The tank was heavy, scarred, and built for punishment. But even at the edge of success, the moment was uncertain. Because in war, relief does not always look like relief at first. An approaching tank can be salvation, or it can be the enemy wearing stolen distance and bad light. Near the American perimeter southeast of Bastogne, the airborne defenders hesitated. The tank crew had to identify themselves. Men emerged carefully from their positions. The connection was made. The siege was broken, not ended, broken. That distinction matters. A narrow corridor is not a rescue parade. It is a wound held open by force. German units still pressed around Bastogne. The road had to be kept open. The shoulders had to be widened. The town still faced attacks after December 26th, and some of the worst fighting around the perimeter came after the moment most people treat as the ending. The garrison survived because the corridor held. The corridor held because the Third Army kept feeding strength into it, and the Third Army could feed strength into it because the pivot had not begun as a guess at Verdun. It had begun as a contingency plan before the crisis became official. That is the hidden architecture of the story. The famous doorway line was memorable because it sounded human. Eisenhower had just become a 5-star general. The war greeted the promotion with disaster. Patton answered with the kind of self-belief that made him both useful and dangerous. But beneath the joke was a harder truth. Eisenhower had spent years managing Patton's brilliance and volatility. He had reprimanded him, protected him, contained him, released him. Patton, for all his ego, needed Eisenhower's authority to remain useful. Eisenhower, for all his patience, needed Patton's violence of motion, when ordinary command rhythm would not be enough. At Bastogne, those two needs met perfectly. One man authorized the impossible. The other had already rehearsed it. By early 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had cost the United States tens of thousands of casualties. Germany had spent irreplaceable armor, fuel, infantry, and time. Bastogne did not win the war by itself, but it fixed the southern shoulder of the German offensive and helped turn a breakthrough attempt into a collapsing salient. And when people ask what saved Bastogne, the answer is usually reduced to courage. The courage was real. The men inside the perimeter had it. The tank crews fighting through the snow had it. The truck drivers, engineers, medics, artillerymen, and infantrymen had it. But courage was not enough by itself. Bastogne was saved by roads, by timing, by intelligence that was not ignored in one headquarters, by staff officers building plans before anyone could prove they would be needed, by a supreme commander who knew how to grant freedom without surrendering control, by a field commander whose arrogance, for once, matched the scale of his preparation. That is why the doorway at Verdun still matters. When Eisenhower joked that every new star brought him an attack, he was not only making light of a crisis. He was acknowledging the man he was about to unleash. And when Patton answered that he always had to bail Eisenhower out, he was not merely bragging. He had already placed the machinery in motion. The map had not caught up yet. The room had not caught up yet, but the order existed. Play ball. And on frozen roads between the Saar and Bastogne, an army turned before the crisis was finished introducing itself.